Welcome to our deep dive into climate accountability, specifically in Pakistan.
Okay.
You've sent us some legal documents about this proposed bill, the Climate Accountability Bill 2024. And it really looks like they're trying to make some serious changes with this, basically trying to make businesses, really own up to their environmental impact, especially when it comes to climate change. So what's the big idea here?
This bill is really about Pakistan sort of stepping up and saying, look, corporations have a role to play in this whole climate crisis thing, and they need to be held accountable for it. It's a pretty bold move. I mean, it really shows they're serious about tackling climate change.
Okay, so let's unpack this a little. What exactly does this bill want companies to do?
It lays out some really specific obligations for businesses that are operating in Islamabad. We're talking about like conducting due diligence assessments, to figure out their environmental impact.
Oh, wow.
Yeah, so imagine companies actually having to like investigate and really understand how their operations are affecting the environment.
That's a pretty big shift from how things usually work.
Mhm.
What else is in this bill that makes it so groundbreaking?
Well, it goes beyond just assessments. It actually pushes for companies to implement these climate-friendly standards in their operations. So it's not just saying they're going green, but they're actually putting like measures in place to reduce their carbon footprint.
So no more greenwashing then. They can't
Mhm.
just slap an eco-friendly label on something and call it a day.
Exactly. This bill specifically prohibits greenwashing and climate denialism. They have to be transparent about their carbon emissions, and they just can't mislead the public about their environmental practices.
It seems like they're really trying to hold these companies' feet to the fire. But how do you actually prove that a company is directly responsible for a specific environmental problem? I mean, isn't that tricky?
Yeah, that is tricky, but that's where this precautionary principle comes in.
Oh, okay.
It basically says, look, even if we don't have like all the scientific evidence to draw a direct line between a company's actions and a specific environmental issue, we're still going to prioritize protecting the environment and public health.
So it's like erring on the side of caution,
Yeah.
which makes sense considering how urgent this climate crisis is. Okay, so tell me, what are the potential benefits of this bill? What could this actually look like in action?
Well, one of the most interesting things about this bill is this thing called the Climate Change Reparation Fund.
Okay.
Basically, companies that violate the law face fines, and that money goes directly into this fund.
Oh, interesting. So it's like a direct line from the consequences of environmental harm to funding solutions for it.
Precisely. This fund is designed to support all sorts of initiatives to mitigate climate challenges. Think about things like adaptation projects, relocating communities that have been displaced by climate change, and even developing sustainable technologies.
Wow, that's huge. Seems like they're trying to create a system where businesses actually contribute to solving the problems they're contributing to.
Yeah.
But let's be real, no piece of legislation is perfect. What are some of the challenges this bill might face?
Well, for starters, implementing and enforcing a bill like this is a massive undertaking. You'd need a strong regulatory body, clear legal framework, and then just the resources to actually monitor what these companies are doing.
Right, because companies might try to find loopholes or, push back against these regulations, especially if they feel like they're being unfairly targeted.
Absolutely. There's also the question of how this bill will impact different sectors of the economy. Will it, stifle economic growth? Will it lead to job losses? These are valid concerns that need to be addressed.
And what about the potential for legal battles?
Oh, yeah.
I can imagine companies with deep pockets challenging various aspects of the bill.
You're right. Legal challenges are almost inevitable. And there's also the risk of these SLAPP suits, which are basically lawsuits specifically designed to silence critics, especially like those advocating for environmental protection.
Wait, SLAPP suits.
Yeah.
Can you explain that a little more?
Sure. Imagine you have a community group, and they raise concerns about a company's environmental practices, right?
Yeah.
And then the company, instead of addressing those concerns, files a lawsuit against that group. Not because they necessarily have a strong legal case, but to intimidate them into silence. That's a SLAPP suit, and they can be really effective at shutting down dissent.
Wow, that's scary. So how does this bill address that?
Thankfully, this bill directly prohibits SLAPP suits, which is a huge win for environmental activists and communities that are fighting for their right to a healthy environment. It basically levels the playing field and gives people a voice without the fear of legal retaliation.
Okay, so it sounds like this climate accountability bill is trying to do a lot.
Uh,
It's setting these ambitious goals, introducing new concepts like the precautionary principle that we talked about, and then establishing mechanisms like this climate change reparation fund. But as we've discussed, there are also some real challenges to consider.
Exactly. It's a really complex issue, and this bill is trying to navigate a lot of different interests and potential pitfalls.
So where do we go from here? What are the next steps in understanding the potential impact of this bill?
That's where it gets really interesting. This bill has the potential to be like a real game changer, not just for Pakistan, but for the global fight against climate change.
That's a big claim. What makes you think this bill could have such a widespread impact?
Well, for one, it could like inspire other countries to adopt similar legislation, especially in the developing world. So imagine a wave of climate accountability bills just sweeping across nations, the ones that are really on the front lines of climate change.
It's like a domino effect,
Yeah.
with Pakistan setting the stage for this new era of corporate responsibility. But let's get back to the bill itself. We talked about due diligence assessments, but what does that actually look like in practice? What are companies expected to do?
It involves like a really deep dive into their operations. They have to look at their supply chains, their energy sources, their waste management practices, and really identify any potential environmental risks or impacts. So it's about moving beyond a superficial understanding of their footprint and really getting into the nitty-gritty details.
So it's not just about ticking boxes. It's about a genuine effort to understand and mitigate their impact. Now, what about enforcement? How do we ensure that companies are actually complying with all these regulations?
Well, the bill includes provisions for third-party verification, so it's not just companies self-reporting.
Right.
Independent organizations with expertise in environmental auditing will be brought in to actually assess whether these companies are, walking the walk.
That makes sense. Having like an independent set of eyes ensures greater accountability. But who are these third-party verifiers? And how do we ensure that they're not influenced by the companies they're auditing?
Yeah, that's a really crucial point. The bill outlines a whole process for selecting and accrediting these verification bodies. So they need to demonstrate expertise, they need to adhere to these strict standards, and most importantly, maintain independence from the companies that they're assessing.
So there are safeguards in place to prevent conflicts of interest.
Yeah.
But even with this robust verification system in place, I imagine there's still a risk of companies trying to, find loopholes or exploit gray areas in the legislation.
Of course, no system is foolproof. That's why this bill also emphasizes the role of civil society. So individuals and communities are empowered to file complaints against companies that aren't complying with the regulations.
So it's not just about this like top-down enforcement. It's about creating a system where citizens can hold businesses accountable.
Exactly. It's about recognizing that everyone has a stake in protecting the environment, and everyone has a role to play in ensuring corporate responsibility.
Now, I'm also curious about the economic implications of this bill.
Hmm.
Could this lead to, job losses or stifle economic growth, as some critics argue?
That's a complex question. Some people argue that stricter environmental regulations can actually stimulate innovation and create new economic opportunities.
Oh, okay.
Yeah. For example, this bill could encourage investment in green technologies and renewable energy sources, which could actually create new jobs in those sectors.
So instead of viewing environmental protection as like a burden, we could see it as a catalyst for economic transformation.
Right.
That's a powerful reframing of the issue.
Yeah.
But even with the potential for these economic benefits, I imagine there will still be resistance from certain industries.
Absolutely. There will be pushback from companies that prioritize short-term profits over long-term sustainability. And they might argue that the costs of compliance are too high or the regulations are too burdensome.
And how does this bill address that potential resistance?
Well, as we discussed earlier, it includes strong penalties for non-compliance, including like hefty fines. But beyond that, it emphasizes transparency and public disclosure. So companies will have to be upfront about their environmental practices and their compliance status. And this public scrutiny can be a powerful motivator for change.
It's like shining a spotlight on their actions and forcing them to be accountable to the public.
Yeah.
Transparency can be a powerful tool for driving change. But beyond penalties and transparency, what about the proactive aspects of this bill? What kind of positive changes could we actually see as a result of this legislation?
Well, one of the most promising outcomes could be a surge in innovation, particularly in the field of green technology. So when businesses are faced with these strict environmental regulations, they often find like really creative solutions to meet those challenges.
So necessity becomes the mother of invention.
Exactly. This bill could create like a fertile ground for the development of new technologies and practices that reduce environmental impact. So we might see a boom in renewable energy, sustainable agriculture, and waste management solutions.
And this innovation could have implications beyond Pakistan's borders. Could we see Pakistani businesses becoming like global leaders in green technology,
Yeah.
exporting their expertise and solutions to other parts of the world?
It's certainly possible. By creating this regulatory environment that encourages sustainability, Pakistan could position itself as a hub for green innovation. And this could attract investment, create jobs, and enhance the country's reputation on the global stage.
It's exciting to imagine a future where Pakistan isn't just reacting to climate change, but actually actively shaping a more sustainable future for itself and the world. But let's step back for a moment and consider the broader context here. How does this bill fit into like the global conversation about climate action?
That's a great question. I think this bill sends like a really strong message to the international community. It's a sign that developing countries are not content to be passive victims of climate change.
Mhm.
They're taking the initiative, enacting bold legislation, and demanding that corporations contribute their fair share to the solution.
It's like Pakistan is saying, we're not waiting for others to lead the way, we're taking action now. But what about the international implications? Could this bill actually influence climate policy in other countries?
It could definitely have a ripple effect. Other nations facing similar challenges might look to Pakistan as a model for how to hold businesses accountable for their environmental impact.
So Pakistan could become a pioneer in climate legislation, setting a precedent for other countries to follow. But let's not forget about the challenges. Even with the best intentions, implementing this bill will be a massive undertaking.
Absolutely. It'll require a sustained commitment from the government, strong enforcement mechanisms, and active participation from all stakeholders. And even with all of that, there will be obstacles to overcome.
Right. We've talked about the potential for legal challenges, resistance from certain industries, and the need for ongoing monitoring and evaluation. But what about the human element? How does this bill impact the lives of ordinary people in Pakistan?
That's where it gets really personal. This bill, it has the potential to like transform lives, especially for communities that are most vulnerable to climate change. Remember the climate change reparation fund we talked about?
Right, the one that takes fines from companies and uses it to support climate action initiatives.
Yeah, that's where like the rubber meets the road.
Okay, but how will that directly impact people like on the ground?
Imagine you have a village and they're facing, recurring floods because of climate change. This fund could actually help relocate them to safer ground. It could help build resilient infrastructure or even provide them with the resources to like adapt to this changing environment. It could fund projects that provide clean water, sustainable agriculture, even healthcare services that are impacted by climate-related health issues.
So it's about empowering communities to not only cope with climate change, but to actually thrive in the face of it.
Right.
That's a pretty powerful vision. But I'm also thinking about, the potential for corruption or like mismanagement of these funds. How can we ensure that the money actually reaches the people who need it most?
That's a really critical point. The bill emphasizes transparency and accountability in managing this climate change reparation fund. There will be oversight mechanisms in place, and the way they allocate these funds will be subject to public scrutiny. Additionally, the bill encourages the involvement of local communities in the decision-making process.
Okay.
So that ensures that their voices are heard and their needs are addressed.
So it's not just about throwing money at the problem. It's about creating a system that is transparent and accountable and responsive to the people it's intended to help. This all sounds really promising, but I keep coming back to the question of implementation. Like, how do we get from piece of paper to tangible, real-world change?
It'll require a multi-pronged approach. You need strong political will. So the government has to be really committed to enforcing this bill and resisting pressure from, those who might try to weaken it.
Right, because there will inevitably be pushback from certain industries or people who benefit from the status quo.
Exactly. And second, you need these really effective enforcement mechanisms. So this means having a robust regulatory body with the resources and authority to monitor compliance and hold companies accountable.
And we can't forget about education and awareness. Like, people need to understand this bill and understand their rights and how they can participate in this whole process.
Absolutely. A well-informed public is crucial for holding both businesses and the government accountable. When people know their rights and know how the system works, they can demand change. It's about empowering individuals to become, active participants in shaping a more sustainable future.
So this climate accountability bill, even though it's focused on Pakistan, it raises these questions that have like global implications.
Mm.
It's asking us to rethink the relationship between business, the environment, and society as a whole.
Yeah, it's a call to action. Not just for Pakistan, but for, the whole world.
Hmm.
It's saying that we can't afford to wait for others to act. We need to take responsibility, hold each other accountable, and work together to create a more just and sustainable future.
Well, this has been a fascinating deep dive. We've explored like all the intricacies of this bill and its potential benefits and the challenges it faces. But more importantly, it sparked a conversation about the bigger picture, the urgent need for climate action, and the role we all play in shaping a more sustainable future.
It's a conversation that needs to continue. We encourage you to learn more, engage in your communities, and hold those in power accountable. The future of our planet depends on it.